All right. Good morning or good afternoon or good evening, depending, I guess, on when you're watching this. And welcome to Crazy Talk. If this is your first episode of Crazy Talk is a Facebook Live TV show, podcast sort of situation where I interview all sorts of people about all sorts of things related to mental health. I am your host, Lee Thomas. If this is not your first time watching Crazy Talk, thank you so much for coming back. I'm really glad we haven't scared you off. I am super excited for this week's episode of Crazy Talk because despite so many technical difficulties, I have finally gotten this amazing person on the show, Jordan Brown.
Wow.
So Jordan is a mental health advocate and social worker in Richmond, Virginia. He writes to inspire by making mental health more meaningful and accessible at www.nerve10.com and is currently one of the top mental health writers on medium.com. Jordan is also head of customer happiness at www.getanswersnow.com, a startup that uses technology to change how parents of children with autism get support. Jordan, thank you so much for being on the show. I'm so glad to have you here.
Yeah, thank you, Lee. I'm excited too. I'm glad we made it through that gauntlet that was the technical difficulties, but we had a lot of opportunities to build rapport, so I think it was good. It happened for a reason.
Exactly. This is like it's the whole what doesn't kill you makes you stronger, and the whole technology is a nightmare, and that's gonna make you a better interview. I don't know. I'm glad we're surviving it. Is all I'm saying.
I've looked at your work, and I'm really impressed by what you do. So I'm glad we finally got to talk.
Oh, well, thank you. I'm also super impressed by your work. And that's usually something that I like to kind of ask people when they first come on the show is that lots of people live with mental health issues and don't necessarily become advocates. So what is it about your experience that made you decide to really want to become an advocate in this area?
Yeah, I think that's true. And I think that a lot of people get into the mental health profession because I finished school recently, grad school, to be a social worker. And I think people get into mental health usually for a reason. They don't just decide to do it because it's fun, because as you know, as you're going through your training, it is tough work. It's not always the easiest of days. But I think for me, it started with the connection. It's actually, I'll just dive right in. It was, my mom had a mental health crisis probably about, it's 2009 when it all started to get really bad. And now I think she got diagnosed with bipolar, which is awfully late to be diagnosed with bipolar. But I'm thinking now more, it was just a lack of sleep that led to psychosis basically. And I had never had any training in how to deal with that kind of thing. And it was me who eventually got my mom into a hospital and got her the help that she needed. And I felt so guilty for what I did, and I didn't know if I did the right thing. Now I know. Now she's doing a lot better. It took a number of years to get to that point, but it was helping my mom. And just I hope that someone would do that for me if I were in that position. And weirdly enough, I actually kind of ended up in a similar position, and my mom, full circle, was there for me, and as well as some other people and some other organizations. But so I got in originally because of my mom. I realized as I was getting involved that, I've always had anxiety. I have, depending on which provider you go to, I also deal with OCD. So I think I knew that I felt emotions a little more differently than most people. And it was in helping my mom that I also learned to help myself.
Wow, that's really heavy. And it's one of those things where I think a lot of the times we talk about family and caregivers of people with mental health issues, and we talk about people with mental health issues as these two discrete groups, right? And we don't really acknowledge that you can be both of those things. And I think that's something that even in my work as an advocate, I don't always acknowledge that because I wasn't both things, right? I just got to be the person with the mental health issue. I never was in the position where I was taking care of family members. That's not to say that there isn't some mental health issues going on in my family, but it was just never, the roles were never in that situation. Yeah. So was mental health something that your family had talked about before? Was this, or did it all just kind of come to a head very suddenly?
No, we never really talked about it. My parents they were good parents, and they did a good job raising me and my younger sister. but we never really talked about emotions. And I realize now just how anxious I was growing up, and how it was both a good thing and a bad thing. It helped me to do really well in school and to just focus on every little detail. But it also was just, I'm sure anyone who's watching this who deals with anxiety can relate. It can become very emotionally draining, just running through all the things you have to do. I have since learned skills like meditation that I do on a daily basis that have really helped me. But no, we didn't talk about it. So when this got really bad and scary for my mom, I didn't know what to do. No one was acting, and it just got to a point that it was so bad on my mom. I was worried she was going to hurt herself, that I just, I went with my gut, and I think that was the right choice. But it's funny because, as you said it, I kind of have been on both roles. I had to learn how to be the parent when it really should have been my mom being the parent. So that was a strange role reversal, but it's what led me into the National Alliance on Mental Illness, or NAMI, and really getting into that, taking the Family to Family course, which is a free 12-week course for family members caring for loved ones with mental illness, and then eventually teaching that for 3-4 years, and I guess still ineligible to teach it to this day. That is what was the springboard for me. That was what made me realize how much I have to offer, and I decided I wanted to totally change my career path and go back to school for mental health.
Yeah, and I mean, I think you're right. Like, a lot of people go into things like social work because they have this kind of personal experience, like through themselves or through family members or through loved ones with things like mental health issues. I don't know exactly how it works, either in the States or in Virginia, but I know there's a big conversation happening in Canada right now around kind of the role that your own personal experience plays in your role as a practitioner. People
Right.
tend to be pretty divided. Like, some people are like, you should never talk about your own experience with mental health with your clients. And some people are like, the fact that you have a mental health issue or experience with mental health, like, actually makes you a better social worker. Is that a conversation that you've been a part of, and where do you fall on it?
Yes, that I would say so. States are making progress with that. I think they're recognizing the support of peers, of those who have lived experience with mental health issues. I think it's extremely valuable. I obviously, on Twitter, social media, and my writing, I talk about, from my lens, I think that's all we can really do, is that we speak from our own experience. And it's helped me so much. But it's still not seen as on par with your typical providers, so typical mental health providers or primary care providers. I wish it would get to a higher level, but it's not being reimbursed, really. It's not always being covered. So you see these peer recovery specialists who are at mental health organizations or community-run community service boards is what we call them. And those are our public mental health agencies in Virginia. But they're kind of on volunteer roles, so they're not getting paid, which I think they are providing value that they absolutely should. So maybe it's not yet where you are. I'm not too familiar with Canada. But I believe in it. Absolutely. I think we need to do more like that.
Yeah, and that's something that we've been kind of having conversations about in sort of the youth mental health advocacy world, is that idea of remuneration, right? Like, people deserve to be paid for their expertise. But when it comes to a topic like mental health, where people often have a personal connection to it, there is kind of this idea that if you really, really care about mental health, you will work for free, right? Like, if you truly care about the cause, then you'll be willing to work for free. Is that something that you've rubbed up against?
It's interesting. I'm glad you brought this up, because I feel like I could talk about this kind of thing all day. It's that, yes, there is an issue that I would say for mental health workers, social workers, helping professionals, that even when you're in school for this, when you're in a training program, is the idea that, okay, you're going to a helping profession, so you can't, it's not ethical to make money, but I really disagree with that. I think that a lot of innovation happens in small business, in corporations. That's why I eventually joined a startup, because I would keep working I've worked in hospitals, I've worked in large mental health nonprofits, and I'm sorry, the system is pretty much broken. there's not a lot of change. I find that you get people who've been there for decades and they like doing it their way. They're not really open to new ideas. And so anytime I would have a new idea, it wouldn't exactly be welcomed. I could excel and do my narrow role, but if I wanted to change the system, it just wasn't happening. And so I feel like I can do more outside of the system. It's just, I know that's not always the case, but for me, I think that's where I do best.
Yeah, and that was my experience as well. Because working as an entrepreneur and as a small business owner, I could do things at my own pace. Essentially, like if I was working in a bigger organization, and I do have some experience working in bigger organizations, change is incremental, right? Like, and it often doesn't happen at the pace that it needs to.
Yeah, absolutely not. It's very slow. You often get, I don't know, like your priorities aren't always aligned with the folks that you're there to help. For instance, in this hospital is one of the bigger psychiatric hospitals in the East Coast and even the country where I was last working before I started with this startup, is that it's all about getting patients through as quickly as possible and just filling more beds. And I didn't feel like I could focus on patient care. And if, as a social worker or just as a human being, if I can't focus on patient care, what am I really doing? I have had enough things happen to me that if my heart's not in it, I got to decide to do something else, as hard as that might be.
Yeah, and I think that's something that we're seeing a lot on kind of university campuses as well, is this idea of let's get these students in and let's get them out, right? Like, and we see that in programs, but we also see counseling centers, like short-term solution-focused counseling is like just the buzzword of all buzzwords when it comes to university mental health. And it's not that like I think people should go to counseling just to like ruminate, but when you have a session that's like when you have a limit where it's like you can see a counselor 6 times in a year, it's like that's so arbitrary, right? And how do you, especially as someone who like lives with kind of long-term chronic mental health problems, that's not a realistic system for me, right? So it's like, do I sit around and wait till I get really sick and then I go to one appointment, or like how do I budget this?
Yeah, it shouldn't be that way. It should be, I'm a big believer in person-centered approach. So if in your research, if you read about Carl Rogers and the father of that whole, the way of treating people, that's where I stand. That's what I do in my practice. But I'm glad you're doing what you do, because I like that you're tying the connections between not just healthcare, like universities are the same way. I can't believe I took some time off from going from undergrad back to grad school. So I felt like an old man, even though I'm not that old. And just to see how, I don't know if corporatized is the word, but there are chain restaurants and residence halls. We didn't have that at all when I was in school. It's so much a business now. Students go, they're the customers, and they expect to, and I know I'm getting off the tangent for mental health, but for instance, there's a gigantic climbing wall, like a rock climbing wall, the biggest one I've ever seen, in this gym that we have where I went to grad school, Virginia Commonwealth University. And do we really need that, or do we need better facilities for learning? Because that's what I think it should be about. But so much emphasis is on getting customers and just building the next big thing, and which is nice, but it also really inflates the cost of getting an education.
Yeah, the joke that we always used to kind of talk about when I went to university for my undergrad was all of these rebranding exercises. We're going to rebrand as a university, and it was like, your mental health services are desperately underfunded. Professors are like super underfunded. But yes, we absolutely need a new logo. Like that is the pressing concern. And it's hard not to, like, I guess this is a real thing as students and as advocates. Like, we run up against these kind of seemingly immovable forces, right? Like if I was to take on the way the university counseling is run, or if I was, to take on, in your example, the way that like a hospital functions, like that's a huge undertaking. Right. So how do you manage, I guess, the frustration of how slowly things move?
That's a good question, because I think what you touched on is that we sometimes get attached, or big organizations sometimes get attached. I try to stay away from this, from vanity metrics and just getting really attached to the rebranding or the logo or something that looks good but really doesn't make a big difference. And I have gotten frustrated because and my parents would say it started when I was a kid. I always want to understand, like, what is really going on. Is what this person telling me really, should I believe it, or is there more going on? And so I even ran I faced that kind of issue in my grad school, where I'd be dealing with professors who didn't always have the best motives. And that's a hard pill to swallow, but I had to trust my gut, and we have a code of ethics that this social work program was teaching us, and I had to follow it. So I think I stick to my values, what I know is right. I read a lot, I learn a lot, I figure out what works best for me, but I also see that there are core values that kind of what we do here on this planet, and I just think there are principles that are universal that I try to adhere to. And so, to sum it up, I think I go back to basics and really focus on the fundamentals. What's really going on? It's a lot simpler than we think, but that doesn't mean people necessarily want to believe it. And so, the more I can test, the more I can experiment and see, does this work for me? Am I really learning something here? The more I can develop my own intuition and just follow that.
Yeah, it's funny because when we talk about kind of like these structural issues, it really does bring in this kind of very inherent sense of right and wrong. And I think that that's a really interesting thing as someone who spends a lot of time on Twitter, like you do, where sometimes those lines get maybe not blurred, but debated, right? Like Twitter is a really interesting online climate, is the way I'm going to phrase that.
Yeah. It's funny because this is coming from a guy who never thought he would spend this much time on Twitter. Of all the places, I cannot believe it, but I just like it. I really like like I said, I like figuring out how it works, and I'm all about understanding the mechanics of it. And again, I have because really it's only been a solid maybe year and a couple months that I've been focused on Twitter. So I had last October, about 300 followers. I'm now at 8,200. And it's all by following just core principles to connect with others, to be kind, and to grow. I think people want to get behind someone that has a positive message. You might get the momentary flashes of attention if you're negative and you're critical of someone else, but that's going to fizzle out. People want to get behind someone who has a positive message, and I've really seen that. And I just have personal rules that I make sure to stick to. I don't want to bore you with all my Twitter machinations, but I will not engage in those heated back and forths. They don't go anywhere. For the most part, almost always, people are not looking to have their opinion changed. So very rarely would I ever get that kind of negativity. I think because I lead by example and I treat people the way that I want to be treated. And it is as much a creative outlet for me, because I'm into poetry. I write poetry on my blog and Medium. There's a weird form of poetry that works really well on Twitter, believe it or not. If you look at some of my posts, how they have evolved over the last few months, there's kind of a format, and I like that. It's very soothing for me. It's something that I can keep up, and it's the one platform that I really enjoy. And so I would say go where you enjoy. If for you, it seems like you do so well with videos, and for me, it's Twitter, and I'll experiment with video down the road. But I just like keeps my brain fresh. I like writing on Twitter.
Yeah, it's funny because Twitter, the way that I consume Twitter and the way that I do output on Twitter are very, very different. So the way that I consume Twitter is like, I love following really, like kind of critical thinkers and like people who are just brilliant in the way that they kind of make these incisive comments, basically. So, I'll read one thing and I'll go like, oh, this is a good thing. And then someone will go like, oh, but did they think about this? And it's like, oh, that had never occurred to me because of maybe like the privilege I hold or whatever, that there could be issues. Like this whole method of critical thinking in, 280 characters, I find brilliant. And some of the most incredible scholars, really, that I've read have been people on Twitter. And so that's been amazing for me. And then all of the stuff that I actually do tweet are like just ridiculous jokes and nonsense, basically. So, like the way, like, I definitely get more than I give in terms of like the Twitter dynamic.
And I think that's fair. I think a lot of people are that way. I know so many people talk to me and say, well, Twitter's impossible. I put a few tweets out there, nothing happened. And so I don't think I'm going to use it. It's not right for me. And you really do have to, like anything, be committed to it. You have to tweet every day. That will factor into the algorithm where you're featured more on top tweets. You do have to put in, just like creating videos or writing, you have to be consistent. I would say the number one rule in doing this and being a creator online is being consistent. If you're consistent on Twitter, any platform, every day for a year, you will grow. There's no doubt about that. And that's kind of what's happened to me. And plus, I'm a little obsessed with it in a good way. You do have to kind of become obsessed with something if you want to learn all the tricks of it. And lucky for me, I've learned to channel my obsessions into positive, I guess you could say positive. I don't know if it's positive yet, but ways to figure out how something works and then go from there. But you're right. I do think a lot of people just get their information, which isn't a bad thing. But the point I want to make is that mental health providers, there are mental health conversations that are happening on social media and especially Twitter. And I think so many people I know, so many providers do not want to be on social media at all because they're scared they'll get in trouble or it's unethical. There's all these excuses. But I don't think you can really say that anymore, because mental health conversations are taking place, and I'd rather be a part of it and learn from others than miss out on that.
Yeah, and I do feel like it's kind of a missed opportunity when, organizations, because you just hear a whole different perspective, right? Like I've been in those boardrooms and I've been on Twitter, and those are two very different conversations that are happening. And if there was a way to kind of bring those conversations together, like I think that would be so beneficial for so many people.
You might be onto something there. That's the great idea. I think, because I've worked in state government, I know that we have meetings about meetings, and it's not always very productive. There's got to be a way to bring in a little bit of that like raw emotion you get and unfiltered opinion on Twitter, which can turn into just atrocious garbage fire, basically. But I think there's also a lot of good there. And yeah, I think you've seen it, and you saw that I'm on there, and other people have found me. I just did a story for some young women. I guess they're like 23, so I can't believe I'm saying young women now. Not that old, I'm 31, but they found me on Twitter, and they love what I was writing, and that I get that kind of thing all the time now. I never would have imagined that people are inspired by something I write on Twitter, of all places, and want me to write for them or partner with them. It's just the world is changing, and it's just so cool to see that you can tweet every day for a year and be seen as an authority on mental health. It's pretty mind-boggling.
Yeah, and that's just one of the so much good about Twitter, and I am super pro social media. Okay. So I was like, I think it's a tool, you know what I mean? So like it can be used definitely for bad purposes. But I think that there's a lot of conversations around social media as though social media is inherently bad. Like we talk about, kind of in like Instagram envy and like looking at other people's Instagrams and going like, my life isn't like that. Or we talk about, the anxiety of being on Twitter because you're watching the world fall apart 24/7. Right. So as someone who, spends a lot of time on the internet, like how do you feel about those critiques?
Again, it does have to come back to making sure you have boundaries it is very easy to spend 12 hours on Twitter, and I see people do that. I actually don't spend that much time on Twitter. I have very structured time when I go on there. Now, maybe since I have 8,000 or so followers, I'm on there a little more because it's just so interesting to see what's happening. And I can put out a tweet and it gets 40 retweets just like that, which never would have happened anymore. But you do have to have structure. You do have to set boundaries because you don't want to get sucked into that. You'll see, and I'm sure you're familiar, you can see some posts that are obviously written in a way to get as much attention as possible. And on social media, it's very easy to go with the most extreme thing, even if it's not necessarily what you believe. I have to kind of be a little jaded when I look at some of the things on social media that I don't know if that's truly authentic. I try to be as authentic as possible. Others, I think they mention that. They say somehow they're able to pick that up. Maybe I exude my authenticity through the screen. I don't know. I really try. What you see is what you get. But you see a lot of people who are just doing things to shock and awe, really. And I don't think that's the way to start healthy mental health conversations. It needs to be a little more nuanced than that. So I try to stay away from that. But it comes down to knowing yourself and knowing when you are getting imbalanced and unhealthy and being able to check in with yourself. I have to take care of myself or I will not be able to engage in a healthy way on social media.
Yeah, and I think like those boundaries, whether it's social media or anything else, can be really hard for people to set when they're struggling, right? Because it's kind of like that short term, like, ooh, this tastes so good. Like with Twitter, right? Like there's the short term, like, oh, I don't need to focus on what's going on in my life because I'll just scroll through the timeline, right? And then long term, things are kind of not being dealt with sometimes.
Yeah, I want to respond to that because that's such an important point, is that it is so easy to go for the likes, to go for the retweets. And that is not why I do it. It's nice. I see it kind of as just a side benefit of all this. I'm very competitive, but I'm competitive with myself. I used to do whatever I could to get people to like me. I was very anxious and thought, I need to make sure everyone likes me, and that's a successful day. But that leads to more anxiety. It leads to not feeling so great about yourself and having lower self-esteem. So I try to, just grow the account, or can I put out a tweet that I'm happy with? Can I get my message out 4 times today rather than 3 times? I try to set mini goals for myself that I can attain and that don't rely on me getting some kind of response. Sure, I think I've been doing this long enough that I can kind of predict what kind of response I might get from a tweet. And that's a little creepy and manipulative in ways, but I just do it because I enjoy it, and I know when I'm like waiting to see how many retweets I'll get, that it's the time to step away and do something else for a little bit.
Yeah, and you mentioned that like this is something that you've been doing for a while, so you can kind of predict how things like are going to be received. I guess. You mentioned that you're on Twitter more, but like has, I guess, the way that you do advocacy changed? Like not necessarily the medium, but like has the message changed at all?
That is a good question. I haven't thought of it that way. I think naturally the medium does change your message. I've read books that speak to that idea. And so even if I don't intend for it to happen, I think it inevitably will happen. Just writing on Medium and writing on Twitter. When you write something online, I've learned the way you format it is just as important as what you say, because so many people are just flipping through pages and scanning articles, looking at top 10 lists, looking at the headlines to see if they want to then dive into the article. And so it's affected how I communicate in emails, for instance. I will do one sentence paragraphs to people in emails, and it's a much easier way to read. I get a higher response rate in my emails. And so it's funny, like I used to write really long sentences and long paragraphs that weren't that readable, but I liked writing that way. But now I've kind of changed how I communicate, and at least online in my writing, to these short little poem type pieces on Twitter, which you may not get all of the insight, but I think it has forced me to condense my thoughts into a way that is impactful and also really readable. So it's interesting. It's changed the way I provide the message. I still believe in the same things, but maybe because now that I've been accepting writers, guest bloggers on my site, Nerve 10, where I'm all about making mental health more accessible and meaningful, I really want to empower people as much as I can. I want to give people opportunities to get their story out there. I've had just such incredible stories that have been submitted out of nowhere, that people finding me from all over the place, from Africa to Asia, Canada, just really all over the world. So I think the internet has expanded everyone's reach. Everyone has a story, and I want to help other people get their stories out there.
Yeah, and I just feel like we're in a really magical kind of time when it comes to mental health, because like what I often say is like, if I had the exact same life experiences that I had, but I had them 20 years ago, I would not be doing the work I'm doing right now, right? Like I would not be able to kind of make a living out of talking about mental health. Like that wouldn't fly.
That's interesting. I feel like we're two peas in a pod here, because I've had these thoughts too, and I didn't think anyone else would think of this thing. But you're right. I was supposed to be born in this era, because I would not have survived out in the wild if I were a caveman. Like I had a heart surgery when I was right before I turned 25, open heart surgery, that I found out out of nowhere, that totally changed my life. Like that was the impetus for so many things. It was kind of a rebirth in ways. So physically, I would not have survived, and I kind of feel like I would still be a poet and a philosopher of sorts. I just maybe would be scrawling on a cave somewhere and no one would see it.
It's always like, it's so interesting. And I just feel like we could talk about stuff forever, but we're actually out of time, which I can't believe. I know, it goes by so fast, right? So for the folks who are watching this, who are going like, Jordan is absolutely amazing, I want to read everything he's ever written and I want to get in touch with him, how can people do that?
So if you want to read, a lot of my writing started on Medium. So go to medium.com, and I think it's J Brown is my handle. But if you search for Jordan Brown, you'll find it. I have tons of mental health writing on there. I've been writing on Medium for a couple of years now. A lot of my best mental health pieces are on there. That later spawned, we didn't even talk about, I realized my website, nerve10.com. I'll do a quick plug for that. It's www.nerve10.com, and I chose Nerve 10 because it's really dorky, but I think it's the most important nerve in the body. It connects the heart, the lungs, the colon, obviously the brain. There's so many different things. So I think mental health is connected to everything we do. That's why I chose that name. But that's my site. I put my writing on there. I also have poems on there, and I have guest bloggers who write there too. I don't even know. I've lost count of how many I have now. I'm publishing pretty much every week. So if you want to write for me, you can get to me through my website, contact me, or just email Jordan, JORDAN @nerve10, and that's 10.com.
Okay, awesome. And I'm sure people are going to be reaching out to you, because this has been an amazing episode. It's been so great having you on this show. So thank you so much for, taking time out of your busy schedule to be here. I really appreciate it.
Thank you. Thank you for the work you do.
Oh, well, thank you for that. For folks who are tuning in and going like, wow, Crazy Talk is so much fun, I want to get episodes of Crazy Talk directly to my inbox. You can do that by signing up for my mailing list at leethomas.ca. That's LEETHOMAS.ca. You can also get access to Crazy Talk by going on my Facebook page, facebook.com/LeeThomasSpeaks. Thank you so much for tuning into Crazy Talk. Thanks again, Jordan, for being on the show. It was an absolute pleasure. And we will see all of you next week, Wednesday at 6 p.m. Mountain Time.